All right, at this point, I think we will get started, or I'll begin the introductions, and then we'll obviously wait for some more people to arrive. But at that point, enough people should have arrived where we can then begin. Um, First off, I just want to say hello to all of you. My name is Justin Ellis, for those of you who don't know me, but based on who's currently in the attendee list, it looks like most of you are very intimately familiar with who I am. I am the executive director of Fuel for Truth. For those who are not familiar with Fuel for Truth, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to equipping Jewish communities as well as supporters of Israel, and in particular within the young professional demographic, with the knowledge, the tools, and the confidence to have today's ever increasingly difficult conversations about Israel, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the issues that tend to come up in conversation about that conflict. Um, our primary program is called Boot Camp. This is a multi-week class for young professionals, which we currently operate in New York, Miami, Boston, and Los Angeles. It's an intensive program that's really designed to give participants a real deep foundational understanding of Israeli history, certainly to become more familiar on a deeper level with the issues that are either driving the conflict or issues that tend to come up in conversation about the conflict. So examples of this include BDS, the accusation of apartheid, the refugee issue, settlements, but also most importantly, one of the things that we do is really equip our participants, like I mentioned before, to have these conversations, especially with those people whose understanding of these issues or whose understanding of reality does not mirror their own. To really equip them with those skills, those best practices and tools in order to engage different types of people, irrespective of their particular opinions about it, regardless of how the other person feels, really the best practices of communication, irrespective of one's own political beliefs, and really to have successful, positive, and continuous engagement with another human being about these really types of sensitive issues. This is the second webinar we're doing in our FFT webinar series. I just mentioned what boot camp is, and unfortunately, because of the current situation, we can't meet in person the same way we normally would. So we have transferred our programming online, which is where we'll be continuing for the foreseeable future. But this is really our opportunity to allow us to continue working not only with ongoing boot campers or our boot camp alumni, which there are hundreds and hundreds of individuals who have gone through this program over the years, but as well as our supporters and the general public who are interested in this material, who would like to know more about Israeli history, about these issues, and as I mentioned before, how to have real positive conversations about them with different types of people. So part of what we're doing with this webinar series is not only going deeper into our bootcamp content and talking about these issues, but also allowing our leaders, our bootcamp instructors, as well as guest speakers in our program to really talk about a lot of issues that are important to them or that they would like to share with you. And tonight we're very thankful to have one such instructor who also happens to be a guest speaker, Yoni Michanie, who also happens to work for a great organization called Camera. Before I turn it over to Yoni to really kind of introduce himself and obviously what we're going to be going over tonight in terms of anti-Semitism in the age of coronavirus, I really want to give a shout out to our amazing partners for this event. First, to Camera itself. Camera and Fuel for Truth have had a great relationship over the years. We've had a lot of Camera employees and lay leaders go through our bootcamp program. We've had a lot of them actually instructors in our class, such as Yoni, as I mentioned before. So it's really great to have this special relationship with them and to work with them for real, mutual goals of educating the public and especially young people about Israeli history and about issues revolving around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As well as our other partner, which is Jewish National Fund. Fuel for Truth is really, really excited to be partnered with Jewish National Fund just because they are really the preeminent organization today that deals with enhancing the overall quality of life and really changing the reality on the ground in a positive way in Israel for the land itself, but also its people. And right now, given the situation with COVID-19 and everything that's going on, there's really still great ways to support Jewish National Fund and to really help them continue doing the essential work that is allowing them to really advance a lot of the projects that are going on in Israel, as well as supporting Israelis who are obviously being negatively impacted at this particular time. You can actually go to JNF's website at jnf.org, and there's actually a list of ongoing projects that need support. Some of them deal with education. Some of them deal with healthcare. And it really allows you to make a real direct and immediate impact in Israel for Israelis at a very particular time. So I strongly encourage you to do so. As I mentioned before, this is an ongoing webinar series that we're going to be doing. We're aiming to have at least once a week that we're going to be doing these. These will be very diverse in content, diverse in the speakers, so it really allows you to get a broader understanding of different opinions about different issues. To keep up with all that we're doing as far as our webinar series, on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/fuel4truth. If you go to the events tab, it'll give you an updated listing of all that we're offering. And I also encourage you to go to our website, fuelfortruth.org. And from there, you can sign up for our newsletter so you can stay even more up to date on everything that we're doing, whether it's these webinars or other educational opportunities. So before we begin, tonight's webinar is about anti-Semitism in the age of coronavirus. Anti-Semitism is obviously a very particular type of hatred. It is not similar, or at least it is not the same as other forms of sort of supremacist hatred that, like white supremacy is obviously based on the premise that whites are superior to blacks, blacks are inferior to whites. And because of that superiority-inferiority complex, white supremacists aim for separation, segregation to move African Americans, away from, their living spaces and certainly what they would view as their institutions. Anti-Semitism doesn't work in that same way. That anti-Semitism, the Jew can be anything that the anti-Semite wants it to be. If the anti-Semite is a capitalist, the Jew is a communist. If the anti-Semite is a communist, the Jew is the capitalist. We've seen this type of anti-Semitic caricatures as well as outward hatred kind of played off this way. Whether we look at Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, in terms of how contrasting they were still able to find the Jew as the ultimate source of societal problems. So one of the things that we've noticed historically is anti-Semitism tends to come out, and certainly in a real aggravated and exacerbated way, when there's other crises going on that are changing sort of people's normal lives, disrupting the status quo, whether that relates to economics, politics, obviously war. And unfortunately, what we're dealing with right now with COVID-19 is not an exception. So we're very fortunate tonight to have someone who's very familiar with this topic, who has done a lot of time researching it and has obviously spent a great deal of time educating, especially young people, about these issues and certainly how to combat it. So I'm very excited tonight to introduce Yoni Michanie, who's going to be the instructor, to talk to you guys about anti-Semitism in the age of the coronavirus and certainly understanding it and what we can do collectively to fight it. So without further ado, Yoni, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Justin, thank you so much for having me, and of course for organizing all of this. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I hope all of you are staying healthy and positive, because at the end of the day, this too shall pass. As Justin said, I'm Cameron's campus advisor and strategic planner, and for the better part of the last 2 years, I've traveled all over the United States to speak on college campuses and other community centers on topics such as anti-Semitism in the US, Israel's place in the international community, and of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict. Before I begin, just a few words about where I'm from, sort of my quick story, and then my connection to Fuel for Truth. I was originally born and raised in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. And when my family basically suffered the huge economic crisis of 2002, when I was about 12 years old, we moved to Miami, South Florida, where I eventually finished high school and then got my bachelor's degree from Florida International University. I majored in Middle East history and Middle East politics. In 2014, Operation Protective Edge broke out. For those of you who don't know, that was the last major military confrontation between the State of Israel and the Gaza Strip. And within a few hours after I was released, I was actually sitting on a classroom again to get my master's degree in IDC Herzliya, where I specialized in diplomacy and conflict resolution. And then I took the very difficult decision to leave Israel because I understood the need to not just advocate for Israel, but to allow people to basically connect the dots in an easier way in trying to understand the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And when I got to the United States and I saw for myself just the sheer rise of anti-Semitism and how that manifested itself in different ways, whether in a college classroom or in community centers or in synagogues, I took an even bigger interest in anti-Semitism. And so that's really what we're here to talk about today. So anti-Zionism, which is basically the hatred of the Jewish state, very frequently tends to traffic in images and tropes and libels that have a long history in anti-Semitic traditions stretching back for thousands of years. For example, when you hear that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip, which of course manifestly it's not, you are abusing that word and trafficking in a classic anti-Semitic trope, which suggests that the Jewish people are responsible for the suffering of another people, or that the Jewish people have a particular kind of bloodlust. You may, if you say that Israel or Israeli leaders, for example, have hypnotized the world to get them to do their bidding, that again goes back to an old anti-Semitic trope: the Jews lead while the world blindly follows. For example, consider Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's tweet in 2012, which of course she wasn't a congresswoman at that point in time, but it's nonetheless been recorded in the long file that has been accumulated under her name of anti-Semitic tropes that have been invoked. She tweeted, "Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken them and help them see the evil doings of Israel." Now let's replace the word Israel, or the Jewish state in essence, with the term Jews. The trope, the Jews blindly lead the world into chaos and disaster, is not a new one. In fact, Barry Weiss, writer and editor in the New York Times opinion section, successfully traced it back to the time of Jesus' crucifixion in Roman-occupied Jerusalem. And she explained, in the New Testament, it's a small band of Jews who get Rome, then the greatest power in the world, to do their bidding by killing Christ. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, speaks to the Jews about Jesus in the book of John. And he tells the Jews, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your own law." But the Jews punt the decision back to Pilate and say, "We're not permitted by law to put anyone to death." And so Pilate does the deed on their behalf. And in the book of Matthew, the implications of this manipulation are spelled out by the phrase, "His blood is on us and our children," the Jews supposedly say. A line that has been so historically destructive that even Mel Gibson decided to omit it from his famous movie, The Passion of the Christ. The trope that Jews, or in this convenient case, the Jewish state, are the cause for another people's suffering is not a new one. In fact, many of the anti-Israel protests that I've personally witnessed or attended, you can remove the Palestinian flag and replace the term Zionism with Jew. And you would easily be reminded of Russia's pogroms, perhaps even be reminded of Nazi Germany. And the issue for those who wanted to hate Jews in a post-Holocaust world was that it needed to be disguised. See, it couldn't be as overt as Nazi propaganda was issued in the 1930s, or it couldn't be as forward as Lenin's anti-Semitic propaganda during the Communist Revolution of 1917. On all three of the issues that I've widely presented on, I've noticed an unfortunate and growing pattern. Distinguishing legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism is becoming increasingly difficult. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'd like to make something very clear. Not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. If that were the case, the largest number of anti-Semites would actually be located in Tel Aviv. But anti-Zionism has become increasingly difficult to detect. That is because anti-Semitism, much like a virus, has adapted to the modern times by morphing itself into anti-Zionism. And in doing so, it has been able to replace its hatred of the Jewish people with hatred of the Jewish state. But to anyone who has had any form of interaction with the history of anti-Semitism, this really should not come as a surprise. See, as Russia's communist revolution took hold of Eastern Europe, Jews were conveniently labeled as greedy capitalists. And as Hitler's Nationalist Socialist Party took hold of Germany, Jews were conveniently labeled as Bolsheviks. In the 1970s, national liberation movements in Africa and Asia spread like wildfire, but only the Jewish national liberation movement was labeled as racist by the United Nations. And now, as white supremacy is on the rise, Jews are, of course, conveniently labeled as white. So in a post-colonial world, where the terms imperialism, colonialism, and illegal occupation have finally been recognized as modern evils by social justice movements and trends, there must be a way to associate these terms to the modern Jew. Unfortunately, there's yet to be a general accepted consensus on anti-Zionism being the world's most normalized and accepted form of anti-Semitism. And while these debates continue, anti-Semitism unfortunately continues to infiltrate mainstream discourse, politics, academia, and the media. And in doing so, it perpetually becomes even more increasingly difficult to detect. And this particularly can be attributed to two different factors. First, accusations against the state of Israel are becoming more nuanced. We don't just have to concern ourselves with the terminology being used, but with its application as well. And the second one, which is more relevant to our discussion, oftentimes, due to a lack of sufficient information, advocates for Israel will rush to categorize legitimate criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. And in doing so, meaningful discourse is often shut down, and there cannot be any common ground reached between both parties who are trying to engage in dialogue. This pushes the people in this particular dialogue back to their respective corners and even more unwilling than they already were to hear anything that might challenge their preconceived notions. State of Israel is not a perfect country, nor does it claim to be. Just like the United States, one might find racism in abundance. Just like the United States, Israel can do more for its LGBTQ community. Just like the United States, Israel can work harder to improve its income inequality gaps amongst both men and women. Loving the state of Israel or wanting to advocate for it does not mean that we personally shut down legitimate criticism of her. Personally, I believe that if we can't love someone, I believe that we can't love someone by dismissing their faults. We can only truly love someone or something in spite of their faults. And the same applies to accepting and recognizing Israel's faults. When I first met Alan Dershowitz, for those of you who don't know him, he's a lifelong advocate of the state of Israel, renowned constitutional lawyer. He was actually one of the leaders in the president's hearings in the Senate during the impeachment trials. When I first met him, I asked him what his advice was regarding Israel advocacy, and he answered very bluntly and shortly, "Don't ever enter a conversation without understanding that Israel is not a perfect country." And Ariel Sharon had a very popular saying about Israel that reflects sort of the same ideology. He said, "If you want to criticize the state of Israel, fight for her first." Now, I don't want to believe that this quote implies that everyone must put on a uniform and join the Israeli military, but I want to believe that this quote refers to the concept of intent. Meaning, when you criticize Israel or when you make a comparison to Jewish history, what are your intentions? So bringing this back to the world of coronavirus as we're living it now, I recently wrote an article that was published last week, and I can share that with Justin as well, that outlined the growing trend on social media of not individuals with a couple dozen followers, but prominent figures in the Twitter or Facebook world, referencing their experiences in quarantine to the experiences by Anna Frank, right? And so, talking about the question of intent, there was one tweet that said, Anna Frank did this for years without Netflix and without cable TV. That's courage. And then the one that really got to me was one that said, at least Anna Frank had a boyfriend to get her through her quarantine. And I think the reason that, to me, that impacted me the most is because the person who made such a comment has to be familiar with some aspects of Anna Frank's history. Otherwise, she would have never known that Anna Frank had a boyfriend during the time that she was in hiding. Now, knowing everything that she must have known about Anna Frank's history, she felt still somewhat comfortable going out and making that horrific comparison, which at the end of the day trickles down to Holocaust minimization. Even as we're talking today, the Jewish community in America is going ballistic as a result of the mayor of New York, who decided to explicitly call out the Jewish community in a general tweet that he was sending, asking people to comply with the quarantine and social distancing. He explicitly called out the Jewish community, no other community, just the Jewish community. So again, this isn't an accusation that the mayor of New York is an anti-Semite. That would be ridiculous. After all, he marches almost every single year in the Israel parades, and from my understanding, him and his staff have a close relationship with several Jewish leaders in New York. But it goes back to the unfortunate reality that anti-Semitism has been around for centuries, and it's not going anywhere. And it's going to continue to evolve. And even people who invoke the tropes that come with anti-Semitism, they're not doing it with a sinister intent, but rather these are the systems of education that they've been affiliated with, right? This is the reality that they know. They believe that the things they say are socially acceptable. And for years, the Jewish community has remained quiet for fear of offending, for fear of not having enough strength to push back. In my opinion, the biggest obstacle that the Jewish community has faced is the Jewish community. But what do I mean by that? I mean that when anti-Semitic tropes are invoked, there isn't sufficient unity within the Jewish American community in the United States to answer back and to push back. And I'd like to give you an example. About a year ago, almost a year ago, in the United States, we were experiencing what the Trump administration called waves of caravans, right? Of immigrants who were making their way through Central America, trying to either gain asylum or to come into the United States and offer their family a better future than their home countries could offer them at the time. Now, disregard your personal stances about how you feel towards the US immigration system. That's irrelevant. I'd like to talk about another instance where Holocaust minimization happened. I don't know if you guys remember, but Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez at the time decided to come out and state that it's morally wrong for the United States to be running concentration camps at the border, and we need to make sure that never again means never again. Now, she was clearly invoking the Holocaust or the memory of the Holocaust. At that point, there was a lot of uproar in the Jewish American community, but nothing compared to what came about a week later when she decided to go on a radio show and talk about the relationship between American Jews and Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and so on. And during that interview, she was asked why she decided to use the terms concentration camps and the terms never again. And she said, if I would have never said anything, if I would not have used those words, no one would have listened. Okay, great. So you decided to advocate for immigration reform in the United States by basically minimizing or taking valor or memory away from the victims of the Holocaust. And I think, looking back, I think, what if she would have tried that with another minority? For example, can you imagine if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez compared the conditions, the living conditions in an American-run immigration center at the border to the conditions of a 19th century plantation farm? Can you imagine the uproar? Universally, both on the left and on the right. I'll do you one better. Could you imagine Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez referencing the waves of immigrants and invoking, for example, the term Trail of Tears? You would have had the entire country flip upside down at the audacity of using those terms. But somehow, when it comes to minimizing the most horrific genocide in history, it's controversial. There's no universal condemnation. It's controversial. And so this takes us back to the ideas of intent, okay? And intentions are everything. And Natan Sharansky, a former Soviet political prisoner, human rights activist, and former chairman of the Jewish Agency, understood this best. And he understood the need to distinguish anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israel enough to leave us with a very simple formula. It's called the 3Ds. The first D is the test of demonization. For example, when the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism. It is not legitimate criticism of the state of Israel. So, to give you a more contemporary example of how demonization against the state of Israel is happening now during the age of Corona, you need to look no further than the social media platform of an organization called If Not Now. If Not Now is a self-proclaimed Jewish American progressive organization which seeks to advocate for Palestinian rights and to demand an end to the Israeli occupation. Of course, just by the sheer way I presented them, there's nothing wrong with them. At least on my end, I am absolutely for Palestinian human rights, and having served in Israel's military and spent a good amount of time on the West Bank, there's absolutely specific places in the West Bank that I'm not interested in going back myself or sending my kids there one day. But what If Not Now has been doing is holding Israel primarily responsible for the spread of the coronavirus inside of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, disregard the fact that in 2017, the Palestinian Authority used 50% 50% of its foreign aid to fund the families of terrorists. Disregard the fact that in 2019, just last year, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, decided to spend $14.5 million in payments towards the families of terrorists and those terrorists who are still alive sitting in Israeli jails. Disregard the fact that those $14.5 million could have been used to buy over 220 ventilators, or they could have been enough to purchase millions of masks for the Palestinian people. But still somehow, if not now, decided to hold Israel primarily responsible for the spread of the coronavirus in the Palestinian territories. Now, that's of course not just wrong on every single account, but it is absolutely an anti-Semitic trope. An anti-Semitic trope which is seen in the form of anti-Zionism. It's basically anti-Semitism manifesting itself into anti-Zionism. The second D that Natan Sharansky left us with is the double standards. And it's the same double standards that has dominated the United Nations Human Rights Council from 2006 to 2015. Because during this time period, Iran, for example, the world's leading exporter of terrorism, received only 5 condemnations. Venezuela, perhaps the most repressive regime in the Western Hemisphere, received 0 condemnations. Libya, spearheading the world's most complex and successful slave trade, received 2 condemnations. Syria, a country which has used chemical weapons against her own people and has created over 15 million refugees in the last decade, received 17 condemnations. But Israel, the Middle East's only democracy, a world leader in technological innovation, and a model of human rights in one of the world's most tormented regions, received 62 condemnations. Now, if we were to make a list of countries whose government was systematically oppressing their own people, you might find Israel at the bottom of the list, and you might find the Palestinian Authority maybe competing for spot 8 or 9 with Saudi Arabia or Iran. This, of course, if not organizations like If Not Now or J Street decide to ignore. In fact, if you look at the rates of people who have been infected in the Palestinian territories compared as to other countries in the Middle East, like Jordan or Egypt or Iran, you'll find that the numbers are incredibly low. And if you really want to get to the bottom of it, you'll find that Israel has gone out of its way to provide the Palestinian Authority with not just financial grants to allow them to get through this very difficult time with as much ease as possible, but tons of medical equipment, both to the Gaza Strip and to the West Bank. And so the question ultimately becomes, with what intention are you singling out the state of Israel? With what intention are you attempting to hold Israel to a standard that frankly doesn't exist for any other country in the world? The third D, and it's the last thing I'll say before we open it up for Q&A, because that's usually my favorite part of the engagement, is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone amongst all other people in the world, this too is anti-Semitism. Now, we're not seeing too much delegitimization during the corona crisis, but the 2 biggest problems that we are facing is Israel being put on a double standard and Israel being demonized. The unfortunate reality is that mainstream media outlets continue to give a platform to individuals who remain, frankly, very outcasted um, in their ability to analyze the rise of anti-Semitism in America, or their ability to connect the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And in giving these people a platform, um, it unfortunately becomes a major contributor to the rise of anti-Semitism in America. So, last thing I'll say before we pop into Q&A is we need to make sure that the Jewish American community, or any Jewish community around the world, or the state of Israel, is not conveniently demonized or discriminated against during a very difficult time uh, for all of the world. If studying the history of anti-Semitism has taught me anything, is that when the economy is bad, when the politics are bad, when there's desperation, um, the Jews should be prepared to fight back. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And we need to make sure that despite the situation being difficult, despite uh, nothing about this being easy for anyone, we need to make sure that we don't allow the corona age to contribute to what was already the rise of anti-Semitism in America. One last thing about Fuel for Truth. Fuel for Truth is actually one of my favorite organizations out there. And the reason is because it's one of the very few organizations that no matter where you are politically on the political spectrum, you'll always be able to find respect and courtesy when you have the willingness to engage in dialogue. And more importantly, Fuel for Truth is one of the leading organizations in um, allowing individuals to develop the necessary communication skills to engage in this type of dialogue. So, Justin, thank you very much for everything you do. And I'd love to answer any questions that the audience may have.
Thank you, Yoni. That was really great. And yeah, just obviously, given sort of the audience we have, obviously, most of you are familiar with the FFT community, certainly what we do, and certainly are familiar with this topic already. If you guys want to use the chat function or the Q&A function, or if you'd even prefer to speak, you can kind of digitally raise your hand. And obviously, we'd love to hear some of your thoughts about what Yoni had described, as well as just your own experience with this particular issue in this particular time.
I think Janice has a question.
Hi. Hi, Yoni. Thanks for speaking to us. So with the Satmar community in Brooklyn, like yesterday, I think there was a funeral and there were 2,500 people that attended the funeral of a rabbi that died from coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen a lot of non-Jews on social media express their frustration. And to be honest, I'm frustrated too, that they're not really abiding by the rules. How would you respond just to someone that
Sure.
I don't know, brings up, because they are not social distancing. They're not the only community, but they are in the wrong.
Anyone right now who's not complying with the regulations imposed by their local authorities is doing something wrong, whether they're Jewish, non-Jewish. And I think you bring up a really good point, in that there should be some sort of outrage stemming from the Jewish community, with members of our own community who are deciding not to abide by the rules being imposed by the city of New York. However, I do believe that the mayor could have sent out his message without calling out specifically the Jewish community. In addition, from what a good amount of my friends in New York are telling me, because I'm based in Boston, there's a lot of people in New York not complying with the quarantine, and that should absolutely be condemned as well. Uh, I think as members of our own community, it's our job to call upon our community and ask them to please respect the quarantine rules that are in place. But the message can be understood very differently if it's coming from A, within the community, or B, from within a figure of authority um, in in um, in the respective region. And I think that's what the mayor failed to understand. My biggest concern, because most likely he did misspeak. I don't think that what he said was intentional. I don't think he, again, had a sinister intention to, you know, exclude Jews or to single out the Jewish American community. My frustration was the Jewish American community in New York, and frankly throughout the country, exploded when that tweet came out. In fact, it's everything that I've seen on the news is related to that almost today. And still 24 hours later, I still haven't seen an apology from him on that same social media platform, nor did he decide to take down the tweet and issue a new one in correction. So that's frankly where I stand on the issue. But you're right. I think the statistics that I read is anywhere between 10 to 15% of New York's Haredi community is not complying with the quarantine, and that should absolutely be condemned. But when it's coming from a figure of authority, it's not proper for the figure of authority to to purposely single out one specific community above the rest.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions, concerns, thoughts?
Actually, Yoni, just another thought that came to my mind. Granted, this doesn't so much factor into the anti-Semitism nature of it, but you had obviously started up talking as far as Israel's connection to anti-Semitic conversations through anti-Zionism. Kind of curious to know your thoughts, like based on the stark contrast of how Israel has handled this crisis, this pandemic, versus the way the United States has, and obviously the Northeast, and for many of us, the New York metro area in particular. What would you say as far as any sort of potential opening that this is actually now creating for whether it's non-Jews, but especially Jews who were once either hypercritical of Israel or who didn't really understand certain components of Israeli society? What potential opening do you see from this that could actually be beneficial of like sort of bridging that gap or educating them in a positive way?
That's a really good question. So before I give you my thoughts on it, I'll tell you something that a professor of me told me during my graduate degree. He said, as a political scientist, you're going to spend half of your time predicting what's going to happen and the other half explaining why it didn't happen. So I can give you my thoughts. My thoughts are in that it's unfortunately not going to bridge a gap, despite the fact that Israel took, transparently, it took very, very aggressive measures against the virus. And with Israeli society starting to open up slowly, we're seeing that maybe the US and other countries around the world could have learned a lesson or two from Israel's decision to handle this. However, simultaneously, you have finally a government that was formed in Israel, which is very controversial amongst American Jews. And the second thing that, of course, follows with the creation of that government is the talk about annexation of the Jordanian Valley, which is even more controversial than the winners of Israel's past election. So everyone is always going to find a way to criticize Israel, and in my experience, as long as the people who have been on the opposition or staunch critics of Israel's government, for example, in the last 10 years, will continue to be in that opposition as long as Likud or Netanyahu or Gantz or the center right or the right continues to sit in power. It's just part of the unfortunate, echo chambers that we've dug ourselves in. It's part of the I hate to say it, but we all belong to it, to, I guess, Neanderthal politics, where we say, you're either on my team or you're on their team. There's no in between. And that's frankly most of the dialogue that I hear between the Jewish American community and Israelis essentially boils down to that. So in essence, even though I think there are significant accomplishments that Israel could definitely brag about during this pandemic, the politics surrounding every decision that's being made right now are just too controversial to, I think, allow the critics to step back for a moment and recognize that Israel did A, B, C, D successfully.
Any other questions for Yoni or even for myself about any of these topics?
I'll say this, if any of you guys have questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly through Facebook or email. Facebook is usually best. But yeah, these are very difficult times that we're all navigating and trying to understand. So stay strong, everyone, and I wish you much health.
Thank you. Here, I saw Janice, I think, may have raised her hand. Janice, do you want to ask another question?
No, that's fine. Yeah, thanks though.
No worries.
Thanks, Justin and Yoni.
You sure we have a few more minutes?
No, just trying to think what, in terms of Israel, like, what are they doing right with the coronavirus that we could talk about in conversation?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. The answer is often controversial, and it provokes the question of whether Americans would accept such measures being taken here. One of the most controversial ones was Israeli intelligence services and the health ministry tracking the phones of every citizen and resident of Israel. That's how initially it started. Second, it started by the health ministry publishing the names of those who were infected, and not just publishing the names, but publishing I think the 5 to 10 previous locations in which that individual had been in before he was diagnosed positively for the coronavirus. The state of Israel mobilized its military, something that we haven't seen in the United States. We've seen the National Guard. We haven't seen the military called up. Israel, for example, had very, very, very strict laws about not leaving the homes of your premises. I think it was up to 100 meters. That lasted for about 2.5 weeks. And as of a few days ago, they allowed people to leave within 500 meters of their house. Um, the police was very adamant about fining individuals who broke the quarantine laws. So basically, the state of Israel took steps that I believe most Americans, or a good portion of Americans, might not be comfortable with. And I think there's a lot more consideration in the United States as far as individual freedoms than Israel, for example. Um, the state of Israel was created so that the Jewish people could have a home. The United States was created to escape the grip of tyranny. And so the concerns and the paranoia, for example, that's been very, very understandable paranoia that has been formed, for example, in American society, might not be as prevalent in Israeli society, which basically allowed Israelis to take much harsher steps. And these are steps, by the way, that you can find in other countries like Italy or Spain. And very interesting, enough, I believe there's going to be studies about this later on, about how Europeans and Israelis regard their civil liberties as it compares to American attitudes towards it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very much to that point. It's not only just on a governmental level in terms of what a government feels comfortable doing in terms of executing a certain policy. It's also very reflective, like you had mentioned before, as far as the society in which is on the receiving end of it and obviously needs to abide by it or certainly cooperate in making it happen. Obviously in this country, in the United States, there's a greater, as you mentioned, a greater emphasis on civil liberties, on individuality, the rights of the individual, while Israel, obviously, due to its Jewish nature, its Jewish character, but even also its Arab and Semitic character, is much more about what is of the benefit of the collective and people willing to make sacrifices for each other on a much more deeper way that most Americans would not be willing to do for each other. And I think that says something as well.
Yeah. And you know what? It's a discussion that constitutional lawyers and politicians are going to have after this, because I think the United States was caught very, very off guard with this pandemic. And I think that, the government is going to sit down after this and say, okay, God forbid, not God forbid, when it happens, we need to be much more prepared than we were now. What are we willing to do? And yeah, I think maybe Israel has provoked that very necessary conversation that American politicians are going to have.
Does anyone have any last questions before we wrap things up for this evening? See someone in the chat. So Jeremy is saying that my biggest issue I had with the whole mayor situation today was everyone is so busy to jump on the anti-Semitism train that they didn't seem to recognize that the stupidity of the Hasidic community helps to make the situation worse. Yoni, what are your thoughts about that?
So, yeah, definitely. Thank you for bringing that thought forward, Jeremy. I think that, the two are mutually exclusive. We can demand that the mayor use responsible rhetoric when addressing the concerns in his, in his region, while at the same time we can work together as a community to make sure that the policies in place are being complied in. Now, again, if the mayor wants to come down with 5 or 6 police cars and multiple officers and arrest every single member of the Hasidic community who's not complying with the quarantine, they have the ability to do so. However, there's multiple fragments of different communities that are not complying with this quarantine. And the mayor didn't feel the need to label them each by name, only the Jewish community. So that's where my problem lies. And like I explained earlier, my even bigger problem is that he saw the uproar that it caused and never came out to explain why he used the words, or maybe even to apologize. So like I said, we can still expect responsible rhetoric from the figure of authority in New York, while at the same time condemn as a community within our own those who choose not to comply with the policies in place.
I'm still on mute. Any last thoughts before we close out this evening?
Last thoughts. Get involved with Fuel for Truth. Get to know Justin.
I certainly endorse both of those.
Yes. Let him buy you a drink.
Or two.
And he will just blow your mind away. But no, really, you know, it's so hard nowadays to find places where dialogue from all sides of the political spectrum are welcomed. And Fuel for Truth has done an amazing job in building that platform. So I urge all of you to take advantage of it, attend as many of the events as possible, stay involved as much as possible. And yeah, and thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you, Yoni. Can you just state again, people, if they want to get in touch with you or follow up on the work that you're doing?
Yeah, if you want to follow some of the work that I'm doing, you could just go ahead and add me on Facebook. My name is featured as it appears on the screen here. So you should have no problem finding me. There's only one other guy I think that has the same name as me on Facebook, but I'm the good-looking one, you know, not the other one. No, but yeah, no, you shouldn't have any difficulty finding me, and I'd be more than happy to answer any question that you guys might have.
Awesome, thank you.
Right.
Just as one sort of final concluding thought, or at least a message here. You know, certainly all of us, you know, obviously something that we really emphasize in Fuel for Truth training and Fuel for Truth programming, that, you know, really to appreciate now more than ever how much that the messenger is as important as the message, that your ability to obviously communicate these ideas or to get people to be more open about their understanding of these issues, first and foremost is reflective of how they view you as an individual. It's not necessarily about what you have to say or what your background understanding is. A lot of this is really human, it's primal, and it's built on relationships. So I know these conversations can be very difficult at times, that we're obviously very, based on our identity, based on our emotions, we're very connected to these topics. It's just to remind you that your greatest asset, and also in turn your greatest liability, is how well or how poorly you build and maintain the relationships you have with those that you're talking to. So I would really just emphasize that regardless of what you're talking about, always make sure that you are maintaining a positive relationship and creating a positive experience that someone's going to want to repeat in the future about those conversations. To close out, as I mentioned before, we're going to continuously be doing these webinars. We're averaging, or at least aiming for, one a week. Next week, we're thankful to have two. One with Daniel Brooks, who is in our audience here tonight, at least based on the attendee list. He'll be discussing language about the conflict and challenging those assumptions, as well as a webinar with one of our Miami instructors, Leon Anjar, who will be talking about how particular like conceptualizations and how Israelis or Israel is perceived is very much rooted in how people perceive or understand Jews. You know, like we were just talking about tonight, how, you know, most people, when they think of who is a Jew or what is a Jew, they often kind of stereotype or direct to Hasidim, to Haredim, while depending on what your country you're from, what society you're from, that could be a very different understanding of like who the Jew is or what a Jew is, and certainly that impacts your perception and understanding of Israel. So that's something that Leon will be talking about as well. As I mentioned before, you can continue to see all that we're doing with these events by going to our Facebook page, facebook.com/fuelfortruth. You can also, on our website, find ways to support us, as well as, obviously, as I mentioned before, getting involved with JNF's great work that's immediately having an impact on the state of Israel. It's immediately having an impact on Israelis who are obviously dealing with a very difficult and precarious time as well, and that could really use all our support. So thank you again, Yoni, for being a part of this. I look forward to doing the next webinar with you, as always. And thank you all for being here tonight. I look forward to seeing you at future digital events. And Bizrat Hashem, may it be soon, may it be now, we do this in person again, sooner than later.
Bizrat Hashem.
Mm-hmm.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.